Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I was in a new town, traveling for work, and desperately needed a haircut. I had been putting it off for weeks, and the upcoming conference wasn't going to wait for my messy appearance. A quick search on my phone led me to a small barbershop tucked between a hardware store and a bakery. It wasn't flashy, just a simple red and white striped pole and a faded sign that read Jimmy's Cuts. The moment I walked in, I felt the shop was dimly lit, and the air was heavy with the smell of antiseptic and something faintly metallic, like pennies. A lone barber, a wiry man in his 60s with neatly combed gray hair, stood behind the chair, wiping it down. He looked up and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Walk in," he asked. I hesitated but nodded. There were no other customers, and I figured it would be quick. He motioned for me to sit, and I climbed into the chair, the cracked vinyl creaking beneath me. As he draped the cape over me, he locked the door. I tried to tell myself it was for safety, maybe they'd had theft issues, but my stomach tightened. He moved behind me, picking up a pair of scissors, and began snipping at my hair with precision. His movements were almost too smooth, like he'd done this 1,000 times but was just going through the motions. "New in town?" he asked. "Just visiting," I replied, keeping my tone light. He nodded but didn't say anything else. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling. The mirrors in front of me were old and cloudy, distorting our reflections just enough to be unsettling. Halfway through the cut, there was a faint noise. It sounded like a muffled thud coming from somewhere below us. I stiffened, and the barber paused, scissors hovering near my ear. "Rats in the basement," he said, his voice casual. "Old building." I tried to laugh it off, but the noise came again. This time, it was louder, followed by what sounded like a soft, desperate cry. My heart started racing. "Do you need to check that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. His hand gripped my shoulder, firm and cold. "No need," he said, his tone low. "Almost done." I wanted to bolt, but with the cape on and his scissors so close to my head, I felt trapped. The cries grew louder, more distinct now, human, pleading. I must have looked panicked because he suddenly smiled, wide and unsettling. "Don't worry, some noises you learn to live with." I don't know how I didn't jump out of that chair right then. I sat frozen as he finished the cut, meticulously brushing off stray hairs and patting my shoulder like we were old friends. He removed the cape, and I all but threw cash at him before rushing to the door. He unlocked it slowly, as if savoring my discomfort, and I bolted out into the sunlight. I didn't look back, but as I hurried down the street, I thought I saw movement in the shop's basement window, just a shadow, fleeting but unmistakable. Later that night, curiosity got the better of me. I searched for Jimmy's Cuts online, hoping to find reviews or something to explain the eerie encounter. What I found made my blood run cold. News articles about the disappearance of several people in the area over the past decade. One mentioned that some of the victims were last seen near the same block as the barbershop. I reported what I experienced to the local police, but nothing ever came of it. A few months later, I checked again, and the barbershop was gone, replaced by a new cafe, no trace of Jimmy's Cuts ever existing. For months after that, I couldn't shake the memories of Jimmy's Cuts. Every time I replayed that day in my mind, I felt like I had barely escaped something horrible. The way the barber smiled, the noises from the basement, and his chilling words all played on a loop in my head. But I tried to move on. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be with lingering paranoia. I kept an eye on local news in the town, half hoping to see some breakthrough, some confirmation of my gut feeling. Nothing ever came up. Then, a year later, I was traveling again for work. Different town, different state. I was walking back to my hotel after dinner when something caught my eye. Across the street was a small barbershop. It wasn't Jimmy's Cuts, but the pole outside and the faded lettering on the window gave me a flash of deja vu. I stopped, staring at it, my heart racing for no reason I could explain. That's when I noticed the barber inside. He was sweeping the floor, his back to the window. His gray hair was combed neatly, and even from across the street, I recognized his wiry frame. It couldn't be him. I stood there, frozen, trying to convince myself it was just someone who looked like him. But then he turned around, and our eyes met. The barber stared at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. His lips curled into a smile, that smile, and I felt like my stomach dropped to my feet. I hurried back to my hotel, locking the door behind me. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind racing with questions. Had he followed me? Was it a coincidence? Or was I imagining things? The next morning, I went back to the spot, determined to prove to myself that it wasn't him. But when I got there, the shop was gone. The building was there, but it was boarded up, and the for lease sign in the window was covered in dust. It looked like no one had had been inside for months. I felt like I was losing my mind. I even asked a nearby cafe owner if they knew anything about the barber shop. She looked at me, confused, and said there hadn't been a barber there for years. That was the last time I saw him, if it was even him. But to this day, I avoid barbershops whenever I can. I've switched to cutting my own hair. It's not perfect, but it's safe. After that eerie encounter, I made it a point to never talk about it. Whenever friends or family asked about my haircuts, I'd just laugh it off and say I was learning a new skill. Deep down, I knew it was more than that. It wasn't just fear, it was survival. For a few years, things were uneventful. I convinced myself that whatever I'd experienced was over. Maybe it had been a strange coincidence, or maybe my imagination had gotten the better of me. But then, 3 months ago, something happened that shattered my sense of safety. It started with a package. One evening, I came home from work to find a small box on my doorstep. It was plain brown, no return address, just my name neatly printed in block letters. My first thought was that it was a mistake, maybe a neighbor's package, but curiosity got the better of me. I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a pair of scissors. Not just any scissors, but the kind barbers use, the ones with the shiny silver blades and the slightly curved handles. They looked old but well maintained, like they've been used for years. My hand started shaking as I picked them up. Beneath the scissors was a single scrap of paper. Written on it, in the same block letters, was one word: soon. I dropped the scissors like they'd burn me. My mind raced with questions. Who had sent this? How did they know where I lived? My thoughts immediately went back to the barber. But hell, it had been years, and I hadn't seen or heard anything about him since that night. I called the police, but they didn't take it seriously. They told me it was probably a prank or a mix-up and suggested I install a security camera if I was worried. That night, I barely slept, every creak and groan of my apartment making my heart race. The next few weeks were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I installed cameras around my apartment and even changed my locks, but the paranoia lingered. I checked the footage obsessively, but nothing unusual ever showed up. I started thinking maybe the police were right, maybe it was just a sick joke. Then, one night, I came home late from work. As I unlocked my door, I noticed a faint, metallic smell one I hadn't smelled in years. My stomach turned, and I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. I pushed the door open and immediately saw it. On the floor of my living room, arranged neatly in the center of the rug, was a pile of hair. My hair, the same shade, the same length, it was unmistakable. I hadn't cut my hair in months, and yet here it was, like someone had taken clippings from a fresh haircut. I didn't even bother looking around. I ran out, called the police, and waited in my car until they arrived. They searched the apartment and found no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no evidence at all that anyone had been there. They tried to tell me I might have forgotten the hair, maybe I trimmed it myself and left it there, but I knew better. Someone had been in my apartment. That night, I didn't go back. I checked into a hotel and started making plans to move. I couldn't stay there, not when I knew someone could get in so easily. A week later, I moved across the country. I didn't tell anyone except close family where I was going. I wanted to disappear, to start fresh where no one could find me. For a while, it worked. I felt safer, like I'd finally outrun whatever had been haunting me. But last night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft sound outside my apartment door. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it made my skin crawl. I walked to the peephole, heart pounding, and looked through. The hallway was empty, but taped to my door was a single piece of paper. Written on it, in block letters, were 2 words: nice cut. This happened when I was 16, and it still makes my skin crawl. My hometown was small, surrounded by fields and cut in half by a set of train tracks. On one side were the schools and the neighborhoods, on the other, a few businesses and the old factory that had been shut down for decades. To save time walking, most kids used the pedestrian tunnel under the tracks, a graffitied, dimly lit stretch of concrete that always smelled like mildew. It was late fall, and the days were already short. I was coming back from my friend Jenna's house on the business side, heading home after losing track of time. It was just after dusk, the streetlights flickering on as I approached the tunnel. The tunnel felt different that night, quieter, like the world on either side of it had been muted. I told myself I was being silly. I just needed to walk through and get home. The moment I stepped in, I saw it, a single balloon floating in the middle of the tunnel. It was bright orange and tied to a string. It's now wrapped around a rusty bolt sticking out of the concrete wall. I froze for a second. Balloons were unusual. Kids sometimes played pranks, but this one looked off. It was too clean, too new, almost glowing under the flickering light. Shaking off the unease, I kept walking, passing it as far to the side as I could. Halfway through, I heard a sharp snap. My head whipped around, and I saw the balloon string had come loose. The balloon was drifting toward me, slowly, like it had a mind of its own. My first thought was, it's just the wind, except there was no breeze. The air was still, damp, and heavy. I hurried my pace, my shoes slapping against the wet concrete. The balloon picked up speed too, gliding in my direction. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to look back. The balloon was right right behind me now, but that wasn't the worst part. Underneath the tunnel's dim light, I saw the shadow it cast on the wall. It wasn't the shadow of a balloon. The silhouette was tall and human-like, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, arms hanging at odd angles. It flickered as the balloon drifted closer, like it was struggling to fully exist in the space. I broke into a run, the sound of my own breath echoing in my ears. The exit was so close, the streetlights just a few feet away. As I reached the end, I felt something tug at my jacket, just lightly, like a hand brushing against the fabric. I stumbled out into the open air and spun around. The balloon was gone. The tunnel was empty. I stood there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. For weeks after, I avoided the tunnel, even if it meant adding 20 minutes to my walk. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I asked Jenna about it. She gave me a strange look and said, "Who didn't hear? A kid got hit by a train there a couple of years ago. People say he was carrying balloons for his sister's birthday when it happened. I haven't been back to that tunnel since." For years, I avoided anything that reminded me of that night. The sound of trains, damp tunnels, even balloons. The experience stayed with me, but I convinced myself that maybe I had imagined the shadow, that my brain had tricked me in the panic of the moment. That all changed last month. I'm 24 now, and my parents still live in the same town. I moved away for college and started a new job, but I came back for a weekend visit. One afternoon, my mom asked me to run an errand to the pharmacy on the business side of town. I almost said no. I didn't want to be anywhere near that tunnel, but it was broad daylight, and I told myself it would be fine. The tunnel was still there, looking just as grimy and foreboding as ever. I hadn't stepped foot inside it since that night, but now, in the sunlight, it seemed harmless. I took a deep breath and walked in. The tunnel was exactly as I remembered. The smell of mildew, the faint graffiti on the walls, and the oppressive silence. Halfway through, I slowed down. I don't know why, but something felt wrong, and then I saw it. An orange balloon. It wasn't in the middle of the tunnel this time. It was tied to the same rusty bolt in the wall, just like before. My stomach dropped. The knot on the string looked identical, and the balloon itself was impossibly pristine. My rational mind screamed at me to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. Before I could force myself to run, I heard it, the faint hissing sound, like air escaping from a tire. Slowly, the balloon began to deflate, crumpling in on itself. But as it shrank, the shadow returned. It flickered on the wall, clearer this time. It was the same figure as before, tall, misshapen, and impossibly wrong. Its limbs bent and shifted unnaturally, like it was struggling to hold itself together. But this time, the shadow moved toward me without the balloon. I turned and sprinted, nearly tripping over my own feet. The hissing sound grew louder, followed by something else, a voice. Why didn't you help me? It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. I didn't stop running until I was out of the tunnel and across the street. When I finally dared to look back, the tunnel was empty. The balloon was gone. I don't know what it wanted from me. I don't know if it was the spirit of the boy who had died there, or if it was something darker, using his story to lure people in. But I do know this. Whatever it was, it remembered me. I told my parents what happened, and they didn't laugh. My dad, who's always been skeptical of anything supernatural, said, "We'll take the long way from now on. I don't plan to go back to that tunnel, ever." I wish I could say that was the end of it, but things have gotten worse. A few weeks after I saw the shadow again, I started noticing strange things happening in my apartment. At first, it was small stuff, lights flickering, a faint tapping on the windows even though I live on the 3rd floor. I chalked it up to old wiring and overthinking, but then the balloons started showing up. The first one appeared on a random Thursday. I was leaving for work when I found it tied to the railing outside my apartment door. It was orange. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of coincidence. Maybe a kid in the building had left it there, but when I checked with my neighbors, no one knew anything about it. The next one showed up 2 days later, this time inside my apartment. I had just come home from running errands when I saw it floating in the corner of my living room, perfectly still. My heart stopped. I knew I hadn't left it there, and my door had been locked when I got home. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at it, until I finally forced myself to step inside. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and popped the balloon. The sound echoed through the room, unnaturally loud. My ears rang for a moment, and then everything went silent. Not the normal kind of quiet, but the same oppressive silence I felt in the tunnel. I slept with the lights on that night. The final straw came a week later. I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in the bathroom, when I heard a faint hiss. My heart sank. I turned around slowly, and there it was, another orange balloon, floating in the hallway behind me. I stared at it, too terrified to move. And then, in the mirror behind me, I saw the shadow. It wasn't just on the wall this time, it was standing directly behind me. Its head was tilted at that same unnatural angle, and its limbs twitched as if they were struggling to stay upright. Its reflection didn't move when I turned around. It just stared at me through the glass, even though there was nothing behind me in the hallway. That was it. I grabbed my phone and left the apartment, not even bothering to lock the door. I spent the night at a friend's place, shaking and barely able to explain what had happened. The next morning, I called my landlord and told him I was moving out. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing my security deposit, I just needed to get out. I stayed with my parents for a while after that, but I still don't feel safe. Even now, I sometimes feel like I'm being watched. Every once in a while, I'll see something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of orange, a flickery shadow. I don't know if it followed me or if it's just my imagination, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. I was studying abroad in Europe, living in a small, picturesque town with cobblestone streets and a huge medieval clock tower in the center. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, quiet, serene, and charmingly old-fashioned. I loved it. One evening in late autumn, I had an assignment that required me to sketch architectural details from around the town. I saved the clock tower for last because it was a focal point and, frankly, the most beautiful structure there. I arrived around 8 p.m., just as the sun had set. The streets were mostly empty, but the tower's face was lit up, its hands glowing against the darkening sky. As I was sketching, I noticed something odd. There was a figure standing on the narrow balcony that circled the tower just below the clock face. The tower wasn't open to the public, at least not at that hour. It was one of those places where you had to buy tickets during the day for a guided tour. The figure was motionless, facing outward as if staring down at the square. It was too dark to make out details, but I could tell they were tall and wearing something dark, maybe a long coat. I assumed it was a maintenance worker or someone who had access to the tower after hours, so I didn't think much of it. I continued sketching for another 20 minutes, occasionally glancing up. The figure hadn't moved. It just stood there, still as a statue. I started to feel uneasy. Something about the way they were positioned, the utter lack of movement, gave me chills. Deciding I'd had enough for the night, I packed up my sketchbook and pencils and turned to leave. As I did, I glanced back one last time and froze. The figure was gone. The balcony was empty. I scanned the square, expecting to see someone coming out of the tower's main entrance, but there was no one. The streets were eerily quiet, and the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock above. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably close. It was coming from above. I looked up and saw nothing, but the whisper continued, just barely audible. It sounded like my name. I didn't stick around to investigate. I practically sprinted back to my apartment, heart pounding. When I got inside, I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The next day, I asked a local friend about the clock tower. I didn't tell her what I'd seen or heard, just casually mentioned it to see if there was anything unusual about it. Her face went pale. That tower's been sealed off for years, she said. Nobody's allowed up there, not even maintenance workers. They stopped letting people inside after someone fell from the balcony about 10 years ago. It was ruled an accident, but some people say. She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. Say what? I pressed. Some people say the clock stopped for 3 days after it happened, and at night, you can still hear them up there. A few months after I left that town, I received an email from my professor asking if I wanted to submit the unfinished sketch for a local exhibition. He thought the incomplete lines added a raw, intriguing element. I politely declined. I didn't want to see that clock tower again, not even on paper. Life moved on, but the memory of that night didn't. For a while, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Stress, fatigue, or even the eerie atmosphere of an old European town could play tricks on anyone's mind, right? That's what I told myself. But then something happened that made me question everything. About a year later, I was back in my home country, working part-time at a local art gallery. One evening, as I was closing up, a man came in just before we locked the doors. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and had an almost unnervingly blank expression. "I heard you studied abroad," he said, his voice low and calm. I nodded, uneasy. "Yes, in Europe. How did you know that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the counter and slid it toward me. "I think this belongs to you," he said. My heart sank as I unfolded it. It was my unfinished sketch of the clock tower, the one I had left in my apartment overseas, abandoned and forgotten. Every detail was exactly as I had drawn it, down to the faint pencil marks where I'd erased and redrawn parts of the balcony. But there was something new on the paper, a tiny, dark figure drawn in the exact spot where I had seen the person standing that night. I looked up, but the man was already gone. The gallery door was still locked, and I hadn't heard it open or close. The room was empty, and the only sound was my own breathing. I quit the gallery job shortly after that and moved in with my sister for a while, hoping that being around family would help me shake the unease. I never saw the man again, but every so often, I feel like I'm being watched. When I'm walking alone at night, when I'm sitting at a cafe near a window, sometimes I catch a glimpse of someone in a long, dark coat out of the corner of my eye. I've stopped sketching, and I avoid clock towers altogether. For a long time, I thought I was finally free of it, whatever it was. But the unease never really went away, and strange things kept happening, though infrequently enough that I could dismiss them as coincidence. One winter evening. About 3 years after that encounter at the gallery, I was working late at my new job, doing inventory at a small bookstore. The store had big glass windows that faced the street, and as the snow fell, it blanketed everything in a peaceful, muffled silence. I was the only one there, and the cozy glow of the shop's lights felt safe. Then I saw him standing across the street. Partially obscured by the swirling snow was the man in the dark coat. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring directly at me. My stomach turned to ice. It had been years, and yet I recognized him immediately. It was the same coat, the same height, the same blank, unsettling presence. I turned away, pretending I hadn't seen him, and tried to focus on my work. But when I glanced back a moment later, he was closer. Not across the street anymore, but standing directly outside the window, his face partially hidden in shadow. His breath fogged the glass as he stood there, motionless, watching me. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of it all. How had he moved so quickly, so silently? And more importantly, why was he here? I grabbed my phone and called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. There were no footprints in the snow where he had been standing, which the officer chalked up to the wind covering them up. I wasn't so sure. The officer offered to walk me home, but I declined. I didn't want anyone else getting caught up in whatever this was. Instead, I called a cab and left town for a week, staying with an old friend until I felt brave enough to return. But it didn't stop there. The final straw came just a few months ago. I was staying in a new apartment in a completely different city, trying to rebuild my life yet again. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of fate ticking. At first, I thought it was my wall clock, but when I sat up, I realized the sound was coming from my closet. My heart raced as I crept toward the door, the ticking growing louder with each step. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was deliberate, like someone was clicking their fingernails against wood. With trembling hands, I flung the closet door open, but there was nothing there, just darkness. The sound stopped immediately, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and by morning, I had packed my bags. I'm staying with family again, moving from place to place every few weeks, always looking over my shoulder. I don't know what's happening or why this figure keeps appearing, but I've stopped trying to rationalize it. About 5 years ago, I was hired as a freelance sound technician for a small, regional theater company. The gig seemed straightforward: run the soundboard during rehearsals and performances of a new play. I'd done similar jobs before, but this one came with an unusual perk: free accommodation in an old, historic hotel located near the theater. The hotel was quaint but a little too quiet for my liking. I was the only guest staying on my floor, and it had that musty, antique vibe: faded carpets, dark wood, and creaky doors. The receptionist warned me the elevator was temperamental and advised me to take the stairs if it started acting up. I didn't think much of it. I was there to work, not to relax. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I'd come back from rehearsals, eat something in my room, and crash. On the third night, after a particularly long tech rehearsal, I returned to my room around midnight. As I turned the key in the lock, I heard a faint click from the room next door. It startled me because, as far as I knew, that room was unoccupied. I paused, key halfway in the lock, listening for any follow-up noise, but it was silent. Shrugging it off, I went inside and locked the door behind me. It wasn't until I lay down that I realized something else. I hadn't seen anyone else in the hotel since I checked in. Not another guest, not even a cleaning staff, just the receptionist at the desk during the day. The next day, I asked the receptionist if the room next to mine was booked. She looked puzzled and shook her head. No, that whole side of the floor is vacant. I felt a little foolish, but figured it was the building settling or something equally mundane. I didn't mention it again. That night, I was woken up around 2 a.m. by a loud thud. It sounded like something heavy hitting the wall separating my room from the vacant one next door. I sat up in bed, heart racing, listening intently. There it was again, thud. Then a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on the wall. This wasn't my first late night hotel scare, so I convinced myself it was pipes or maybe an animal trapped in the walls. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sounds were deliberate. They had a patter to them. I put on my headphones, blasted some white noise, and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I decided to mention it to the receptionist again. She looked a little uneasy this time and said she'd have someone check the room, just in case. That night, I came back from the theater later than usual. Close to 1 a.m. as I climbed the stairs to my floor, I noticed the hallway lights were dimmer than usual. Only every other bulb seemed to be working. When I reached my door, I froze. The door to the room next to mine was wide open. I couldn't see much inside. It was pitch black beyond the doorway. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, every instinct screaming at me to go back downstairs and tell the receptionist. But I didn't. Against my better judgment, judgment, I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight. I shone the light into the room, and it was empty, not just unoccupied, but stripped bare, no bed, no furniture, no curtains. Just an empty room with peely wallpaper and an old radiator in the corner. And then I heard it tap, tap, tap right behind me. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. My flashlight beam flickered for a moment, and then the tapping started again, louder this time, echoing down the hall. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside on the street. I didn't care that it was freezing, or that I was wearing pajamas and had left my wallet and keys in the room. I sat on a bench across the street until sunrise, staring up at the window of my room, half expecting to see someone or something watching me. The next morning, I checked out and told the receptionist I wouldn't be staying for the rest of the production. She didn't seem surprised. As I left, she said something that still chills me. You're not the first guest to complain about that room, but you're the first one who left without finishing your stay. After I left the hotel, I didn't want to think about when it happened. I told myself it was probably just my imagination or a prank by some local kid sneaking into the old building. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong with that place. The play wrapped a couple of weeks later, and I moved on to another project in a completely different city. Life went on. I didn't tell anyone about my experience, partly because it felt too bizarre to explain and partly because I didn't want to seem paranoid. About 6 months later, I received an email from one of the actors in the play. We weren't particularly close, so I was surprised to hear from them. The subject line just read, "The Hotel." Curious and a little uneasy, I opened the email. It was short, only a couple of sentences. "Hey, I remembered you stayed at the during rehearsals. Just thought you should know. One of the new actors stayed there for a few nights and had some weird stuff happen, too. She ended up leaving mid-run and wouldn't say why. Thought you might find it interesting." My stomach dropped. I replied, asking for more details, but they didn't have much else to share, just that the actor had checked out without an explanation, leaving her things behind, and hadn't been in touch with the company since. I wanted to let it go, but curiosity got the better of me. I started searching online for anything about the hotel, reviews, news articles, local history. Most of what I found were generic comments about how charming and historic it was, but one post on a small travel forum caught my attention. It was from someone who had stayed there years earlier. Their story was eerily similar to mine: strange noises, the feeling of being watched, and unexplained tapping from an empty room. But they mentioned one detail I hadn't told anyone. The tapping started slow and quiet, but it always ended with 3 loud knocks, like someone pounding on the wall. I slammed my laptop shut. That was exactly what I'd heard the night I ran out. For weeks, I avoided looking into it any further. I wanted to forget, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Eventually, I caved and reached out to a local historian who specialized in old buildings in the area. I didn't mention my experience, just asked if they knew anything unusual about the hotel. Their response gave me chills. The historian told me the hotel had been built in the early 1900s and had changed hands several times over the decades. During its heyday, it was a popular spot for traveling salesmen and performers, but it had also been the site of several unexplained disappearances. Most were dismissed as guests skipping out on their bills or moving on without notifying anyone, but there was one case in particular that stood out. In the 1930s, a sound technician, like me, had stayed at the hotel while working on a local theater production. He was known to be meticulous and punctual, but one day he simply vanished. His belongings were left neatly packed in his room, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The only clue was a report from another guest who claimed to have heard loud tapping sounds coming from his room the night before he disappeared. The police investigated but found nothing. The case went cold, and the story became a local legend. Over time, it was mostly forgotten, except by those who knew the hotel's history. I haven't been back to that town since. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed longer, tried to figure out what was really going on. But then I think about that empty room, the open door, the tapping that seemed to follow me down the hall. For years, I managed to push the experience to the back of my mind, chalking it up to something I'd rather not understand. But the truth has a way of creeping back in when you least expect it. About 2 years after my stay at the hotel, I was visiting a friend in another part of the country. We were catching up over drinks when he mentioned he'd been working on a podcast series about urban legends and local hauntings. Curious, I asked if he'd ever come across anything about the hotel. He hadn't, but he was immediately intrigued. When I told him the bare bones version of my experience, he insisted on recording it for his show. I reluctantly agreed, on the condition that he kept my name anonymous. I didn't want to be the person known for some ghost story, but part of me also wanted to know if anyone else had experienced something similar. The episode aired a few months later. To my surprise, it got a lot of attention. Listeners started writing in, sharing their own experiences at the hotel. Most of them were vague. Feelings of unease, hearing footsteps in empty hallways, or seeing shadows move in the corner of their vision. But a few were more specific. One person described staying in a room that sounded a lot like mine. They'd woken up in the middle of the night to the sound of tapping on the wall. Thinking it was a neighboring guest, they knocked back, The tapping stopped immediately, and a few moments later, they heard 3 loud bangs on their door. When they opened it, no one was there, but the door to the room next door, the same one I'd seen open, was ajar. Another listener claimed they worked at the hotel as a housekeeper years ago. She refused to clean the rooms on my floor unless someone else was with her. She said she often found strange things left behind in the empty rooms, scratched up furniture, broken picture frames, and once, an old reel of tape from a sound recorder. When she played it out of curiosity, all she heard was static and fade tapping. My friend was thrilled with the response to the episode, but I couldn't share his excitement. Every story just brought back memories I tried to bury. I stopped listening to his podcast after that, not because it wasn't good, but because it felt like tempting fate. Then, one night, I got an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "We need to talk." Against my better judgment, I opened it. It was from someone claiming to be a former maintenance worker at the hotel. He said he'd listened to the podcast and recognized my story. According to him, the room next to mine wasn't just another guest room. It used to be a storage space for the theater across the street, back when the hotel and theater were under the same ownership. That's when he dropped the real bombshell. He claimed there were reports, hidden in old maintenance logs, of strange noises coming from that room long before it was converted into a guest room. Workers heard tapping, muffled voices, and sometimes music, even when the room was completely empty. One worker even swore he heard someone calling his name. But the strangest part, the room had been sealed off for decades. The door I'd seen open wasn't supposed to exist. I stared at the email, my stomach twisting. I wanted to dismiss it as a prank, but something about the way it was written, so matter of fact, with details I hadn't shared publicly, made it feel authentic. I replied, asking for proof. The man sent a scanned copy of an old blueprint of the hotel. Sure enough, the space where the room should have been was marked as sealed storage. I blocked his email after that. I didn't want to know anything else. If the room wasn't supposed to exist, then what had I seen? What had I heard? Even now, I think about it sometimes. Late at night, when the house is quiet, I'll hear faint tapping, a tree branch on the window, maybe, or the pipe settling. At least, that's what I tell myself. And every time, I have to resist the urge to knock back. This happened about 6 years ago when I was 22 and working as an admin assistant at a small law firm in a mid-sized city. It was a quiet job, mostly scheduling meetings, organizing files, and answering phones. Nothing exciting ever really happened, and I liked it that way. One Thursday afternoon, I was alone in the office. My boss was in court, and my coworkers had all left early for a team building retreat I couldn't attend because of a stomach bug earlier that week. The office was silent except for the hum of my desktop computer and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. Around 4 p.m., the phone rang. "Good afternoon, Jensen and Parker Law," I said automatically. There was a pause on the other end. Then a man's voice, smooth, deliberate, spoke. "Is this Erica?" I froze. My name wasn't on the website or the voicemail greeting. In fact, there was no public-facing information about me at all. "Oh, yes. Who's calling?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't worry about that," he replied. "I just wanted to thank you for the coffee this morning. You looked so nice in your green sweater." My blood went cold. I had stopped for coffee that morning, but I hadn't spoken to anyone in the shop. My sweater was green. "I think you have the wrong person," I stammered. "No, Erica," he said, almost laughing. "I don't." I hung up, my hands trembling. I immediately checked the office door. It was locked, and peeked out the windows. The street below was bustling with commuters and choppers. No one stood out. I spent the next hour trying to focus on work, but every sound, every distant footstep, every phone notification made me jump. At 5 p.m., I grabbed my bag and left in a hurry. The next day, my boss called me into his office. He handed me a small, unmarked envelope that had been left at the front desk that morning. Inside was a single photograph, me sitting at my desk, taken through the office window. My green sweater was unmistakable. My boss called the police immediately. They took the photo as evidence but didn't seem particularly optimistic. "It's probably just some creep playing a prank," one of the officers said. I didn't feel comforted. That weekend, I stayed at my friend Melissa's apartment, too scared to be alone in my tiny studio. On Sunday night, as we were watching TV, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Missed you at the office Friday, Erica. I'll see you tomorrow." I didn't go to work the next day or any day after that. I quit my job, moved to a new city, and changed my phone number. The police never found out who sent the photo or the text, and no one ever came forward about the envelope. To this day, I have no idea how he knew my name, where I worked, or why he chose me. For a long time, I thought the nightmare was over. Moving to a new city brought some comfort, and I started fresh in a new job. I kept to myself, didn't post anything personal online, and stayed hyper aware of my surroundings. But then, about a year later, something happened that shook me to my core. I was living in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a secure building. It wasn't fancy, but it had a locked front entrance, and you needed a key fob to get past the lobby. It felt safe, until one evening when I came home from work. There, on the mat outside my door, was another envelope. No postage, no name. Just like the first one, let heart sake. With shaky hands, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 words typed in bold. This made. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My mind raced. How had he found me? I had changed everything. My address, my phone number, even my name on social media. I called the building manager immediately, but the security cameras in the hallways had been malfunctioning for weeks. No footage, no leads. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every muffled voice in the hallway made my heart race. The next morning, I packed a bag and went to stay with a coworker. I didn't want to be alone, not until I figured out what to do. That was the start of another spiral. I started getting texts again, this time from a new number. They were simple, almost casual, but they made my blood run cold. Nice place. Red looks good on you. Don't move again. It's exhausting to keep finding you. Each message chipped away at my sanity. I felt watched everywhere I went. I stopped walking to work, stopped going to the grocery store, even stopped sitting near windows. I reported everything to the police, but without clear evidence, there wasn't much they could do. One night, about 2 months after the envelope appeared, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was 3:17 a.m., another unknown number. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The message was a single photo. It was me, asleep in my bed. My stomach dropped. I turned on every light in my apartment and grabbed a kitchen knife before calling 911. The police arrived within minutes, but they didn't find anyone. My door had been locked, and all the windows were secure. It didn't make sense. They searched the building and found no signs of forced entry, no strangers wandering the halls. One of the officers suggested it could be a prank, maybe even a tech-savvy stalker hacking into a smart device. I didn't have any smart devices. I left that apartment the next morning and never went back. Since then, I've moved twice more, changed my number again, and live in a state of constant paranoia. The messages have stopped, for now, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to remind me he hasn't forgotten. For a while, I thought I'd finally escaped him. Months turned into years, and the silence became almost comforting. I'd moved to a new state, changed jobs, and even legally altered my last name. I didn't tell anyone outside my closest circle where I lived. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd outrun him. But then, last month, I got a package. It wasn't delivered to my apartment, it came to my workplace. The receptionist handed it to me with a casual smile, completely unaware of the wave of dread that hit me. My name was handwritten on the box in neat, block letters. No return address. I hesitated before opening it. My coworkers were around, and I didn't want to cause a scene, so I brought it home, set it on my kitchen counter, and stared at it for what felt like hours before finally slicing the tape. Inside was a single item, a snow globe. It seemed innocent enough, a small glass dome with a scene of a little white house surrounded by trees. But as I shook it, something inside caught my eye. Under the artificial snow, there was a tiny, blurry photograph tucked against the base. My hands trembled as I tilted the globe to get a better look. It was a photo of me, at my new apartment. I couldn't breathe. The photo wasn't recent, thank God, but it was unmistakably from my current building. It had been taken during my first week there. The exact outfit and time of day burned into my memory. He'd found me again. I called the police, shaking so hard I could barely dial. When the officer arrived, I handed over the globe and explained everything. He was kind but skeptical, pointing out that there was no direct threat in the package. It could just be a strange coincidence, he said, his tone almost patronizing. But I knew better. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. For the next week, I didn't sleep. Every sound outside my window, every flicker of light in the hallway made my heart pound. I started double-checking every lock, every blind, every shadow. I even took time off work, too scared to leave my apartment. And then, last night, it happened. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not in the hallway, not outside my window, inside my apartment. My heart raced as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving from the living room toward the hallway. My apartment wasn't large. Whoever was out there would reach my bedroom in seconds. I dialed 911 with trembling fingers and whispered into the phone, "There's someone in my apartment." The operator told me to stay quiet and stay on the line, but I could barely focus. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. The silence was suffocating, and then, with agonizing slowness, the door handle turned. I screamed, raising the bat, just as the sound of sirens filled the street outside. The intruder must have heard them too because the handle stopped turning, and I heard frantic footsteps retreating toward the living room. By the time the police arrived, the door was wide open, but he was gone. The officers found no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been disturbed. disturbed, except for one thing. Sitting on my kitchen counter was another snow globe. This one held a tiny replica of my apartment building, and inside it, just like before, was a small, blurry photograph of me. A few years ago, I worked the night shift as a float nurse at a large urban hospital. Being a float nurse meant I didn't have a permanent unit. I got assigned wherever they needed extra hands. I loved it because no 2 nights were ever the same. That is, until one night made me regret ever taking the job. It started like any other shift. I was assigned to the 4th floor, a mix of post-opus patients and some recovery from more serious illnesses. It wasn't my usual stomping ground, but I was familiar with the layout. The staff warned me that we had one patient, an elderly man named Mr. Hughes, who was known for wandering the halls at night. Just keep an eye out. They said he's harmless but likes to explore. The night started uneventfully. Around 2 a.m., I went to check on Mr. Hughes. His room was at the end of the hall, tucked into a quieter corner. As I approached, I noticed his bed was empty. Not surprising, I figured he was wandering again. I glanced up and down the hallway but didn't see him. I headed toward the nurse's station to ask if anyone had seen him. That's when I heard it. A faint shuffling sound, like slippers dragging against the linoleum, coming from the direction of the elevators. Relieved, I followed the sound, assuming I'd find Mr. Hughes. But when I turned the corner, the hallway was empty. The shuffling stopped. Feeling uneasy, I checked the elevators, the stairwell, even the break room, but there was no sign of him. I returned to his room to check if he'd somehow made it back without me noticing. When I opened the door, my stomach dropped. Mr. Hughes was in his bed, fast asleep. I shook it off as my imagination and continued my rounds. About an hour later, I was charting at the nurse's station when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It was too dark to make out details, but it looked like someone in a hospital gown. Thinking it might be another patient, I called out, "Do you need help?" The figure didn't respond. I stood and started walking toward them. "Are you okay?" I asked again. As I got closer, I realized the figure wasn't standing still. It was swaying slightly, side to side. I reached for the light switch on the wall, but the second the lights came on, the hallway was empty. I checked every room in that hallway, every closet, every corner. No one was there. By this point, my nerves were shot. I returned to the nurse's station and stayed glued to my chair. Around 4 a.m., a patient's call light went off, room 423, one of the surgical recovery rooms. I grabbed my chart and headed down the hall, but when I got to the room, the patient was sitting up in bed, wide-eyed and trembling. "Are you okay?" I asked, concerned. She nodded but said, "There was someone in here." I froze. "What do you mean?" She described a man in a hospital gown standing at the foot of her bed. He just stood there, watching me. He didn't say anything. I thought maybe he was confused or lost, but when I blinked, he was gone. I tried to reassure her, but I felt anything but calm. I did another sweep of the floor, checking on every patient, but everything seemed normal. The rest of the night was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. At the end of my shift, I told the charge nurse what had happened. She gave me a strange look and said, "You were on the 4th floor, right? That used to be the psych unit before they remodeled. We had a patient who passed away years ago, a man who used to wander the halls at night. Staff have reported seeing him ever since. Needless to say, I never floated to the 4th floor again. After that night, I did everything in my power to avoid being assigned to the 4th floor. I traded shifts, volunteered for double duty in the and even begged my supervisor to keep me on other units. She thought I was being dramatic, but thankfully she obliged. For months, I managed to steer clear of that place. Life went on, and I started to convince myself that maybe I had imagined most of it. I chalked it up to stress, lack of sleep, and the natural spookiness of working nights in a hospital. But then, about 6 months later, the 4th floor found me again. We were short-staffed that night, and I was the only float nurse available. My heart sank when I saw my assignment, the 4th floor. I tried to argue, but it was no use. The charge nurse assured me it was just another shift. "You'll be fine," she said. "That floor's been quiet lately." Quiet, right. I stepped off the elevator and was hit with the same uneasy feeling I'd had before. The hallway seemed darker, the air heavier. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and told myself to get through the night. The first few hours were uneventful. I focused on my tasks, avoiding the end of the hallway as much as possible. Around 3 a.m., the building felt eerily still. I was finishing up some paperwork at the nurse's station when the call light for room 423 went off again. My stomach churned. That was the same room as before. I grabbed my chart and walked to the room, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. When I opened the door, the patient, a middle-aged man recovering from surgery, was sitting up in bed, his face face pale. "Are you okay?" I asked, already knowing what he would say. "There was someone in here," he whispered. "I thought it was you at first, but they were just standing there." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Did you see where they went?" He shook his head. "No, they just disappeared." I reassured him as best I could, but my hands were shaking as I adjusted his blankets and left the room. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt a sudden chill. The air was ice cold, far colder than the rest of the building. I glanced over my shoulder and saw it, the figure. This time, I could see him clearly. A gaunt man in a faded hospital gown, his features hollow and his eyes dark. He stood at the far end of the hallway, completely still. My heart pounded as I blinked, expecting him to vanish like before, but he didn't. He started walking toward me. I froze, my mind racing. He wasn't shuffling like Mr. Hughes had. His steps were deliberate, purposeful. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He was halfway down the hall when the lights above him flickered and went out. When they came back on, he was gone. I didn't finish my shift that night. I called the charge nurse, handed over my pager, and left. I didn't even bother explaining. I just said I was feeling sick. I never worked another night shift again. I switched to day shifts in a different unit and eventually left the hospital altogether. I still don't know what I saw on that floor. Maybe it was a lingering spirit tied to the place where it spent its final days. Maybe it was something darker, but whatever it was, I hope I never see it again. You think that leaving the hospital would have been the end of it, but sometimes places, or whatever resides in them, don't let go so easily. About a year after I left the hospital, I started having strange dreams. At first, they were vague, just a sense of being watched in a dimly lit hallway, but over time, they became more vivid. In the dreams, I was back on the 4th floor, walking down that same corridor. It always ended the same way. I'd see the man in the hospital gown standing at the end of the hall, his dark eyes locked onto mine. No matter how much I tried to turn or wake myself up, I couldn't. He'd start walking toward me, each step echoing louder and louder until I woke up gasping for air. I told myself they were just nightmares, a lingering reaction to a traumatic experience. But then things started happening while I was awake. One night, I was working late in my new job at a clinic. The building was empty except for me and the janitor. I was filing some paperwork when I felt it, that same icy chill I'd felt on the 4th floor. My breath caught, and I turned around, expecting to see him standing there. The hallway was empty. Shaking it off, I went back to work. But as I was locking up for the night, I heard faint shuffling footsteps coming from the back office. My heart sank. I knew I was the only one there. For a split second, I thought about going to check, but fear took over and I bolted out of the building. It didn't stop there. Lights in my apartment began flickering for no reason. Doors I knew I closed would be slightly ajar when I came back. Once, I woke up to find my bedroom window open, though I always locked it before bed. My cat, usually calm and affectionate, started hissing at empty corners of the room. The worst came about a month later. I was staying at my parents' house for the weekend, trying to escape the unease that had been following me. Late one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my childhood bedroom. I thought it was my dad, but when I called out, the steps stopped abruptly. The door to my room creaked open just an inch. "Dad," I whispered. No response. The door stayed still for a moment, then slowly began to close. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my mom everything. She didn't say much, but later I overheard her talking to my dad. "Do you think she brought something back with her?" she whispered. I didn't ask what she meant. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Eventually, I moved to a new city, desperate for a fresh start. For a while, things seemed better. The dream stopped, the strange occurrences faded, and I started to feel like myself again. But last week, as I was leaving work, I passed by a reflective glass door. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a faint, shadowy figure standing just behind me, a man in a hospital gown. When I whipped around, there was no one there. I don't know if I'll ever truly escape him. Maybe some doors, once opened, can never be closed. My company had sent me to a trade show in a city halfway across the country. The trip was fine, nothing unusual, but my flight home was delayed late into the evening. By the time we were finally boarding, the terminal was nearly empty and a weird, eerie quiet hung in the air. I was seated near the back of the plane, a few rows away from a flight attendant station. The cabin was maybe a third full, and most people were spread out, claiming whole rows to themselves. I thought I was alone in my row until a man in a tattered jacket plopped down 2 seats away from me, reeking of stale alcohol and something metallic. He didn't have any luggage, not even a carry-on. He had this old, battered notebook clutched in his hands. His knuckles were raw, and there was a faint but noticeable bloodstain on his shirt collar. He stared straight ahead, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't make out. I immediately felt uneasy, but I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just having a bad day, and I'd be back home soon. Still, I texted a friend about the guy, jokingly saying, "If I don't make it, blame seat 28B. The plane took off, and everything seemed fine for the first hour. Most of the lights lights were dimmed, and the flight attendants were going through the motions of serving drinks. That's when I noticed the man had started writing furiously in his notebook. Every so often, he'd glance sideways at me, his pen freezing mid-word. The flight was quiet enough that I could hear him whispering under his breath again. I leaned just slightly to try to catch what he was saying. It wasn't in English, maybe Latin or something that sounded ancient. His voice got louder, but not enough to attract attention from the flight attendants or other passengers. And then he stopped. He turned and looked directly at me for the first time. His eyes were a pale, watery blue that almost seemed to glow in the dim light. Earmarked, he said, his voice low but steady. "I'd move if I were you." I froze. He turned back to his notebook and resumed writing, ignoring me completely. My heart was racing, but I didn't want to make a scene, so I stayed in my seat, silently begging the plane to land. It wasn't long before things got even stranger. A flight attendant came to check on us, and when she reached our row, her polite smile faltered. She glanced at the man, her brow furrowing as if she was trying to place him. Then she said, almost hesitantly, "Sir, are you feeling okay?" The man didn't look up, just kept scribbling in his notebook, but he muttered something that made the flight attendant's face go pale. She backed away, mumbling, "I'll get you some water," before disappearing down the aisle. The plane started to feel colder. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it didn't help. I noticed a few other passengers shivering or rubbing their arms. The lights above us flickered, and the man chuckled quietly, still writing. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, pretending I needed to use the restroom, and moved to an empty row near the middle of the plane. As soon as I sat down, I felt warmer, safer. The man didn't look at me again for the rest of the flight, but I could feel his presence like a weight on my chest. When we landed, I practically sprinted off the plane. I waited in the terminal, watching to see if the man got off, but he never did. I even asked one of the flight attendants if she'd seen him, and she gave me a confused look. There was no one in 28B, she said. We were sitting alone. After that flight, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something had followed me. I'd always been skeptical of the paranormal, but the experience left me questioning everything. At first, I tried to chalk it up to exhaustion, stress, or even some kind of waking dream, but the strange occurrences didn't stop once I was back home. The first incident happened the night I got back. My apartment felt off as soon as I walked in, like it wasn't entirely empty, even though I lived alone. My cat, normally the first to greet me, was nowhere to be found. I finally found her hiding under the bed, growling softly, her eyes wide and fixed on the empty doorway. I figured she was just spooked by me being away, so I tried to comfort her, but she wouldn't come out. That night, I had a vivid nightmare. I was back on the plane, sitting in 28B. The man was there, scribbling furiously in his notebook. Except this time, he wasn't muttering, he was laughing, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. When he looked at me, his eyes were completely black, and his voice echoed in my head, "You didn't listen." Earmarked. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The air in my room felt heavy, and I could swear I heard faint scratching sounds coming from the walls. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day at work, things got even weirder. My computer screen flickered, and my files kept randomly closing. At first, I thought it was a glitch, but then I noticed a single file on my desktop that I didn't recognize. Its name was just a string of random numbers. Furious but hesitant, I opened it. The file was blank except for one line of text, "You can't outrun what's already inside you." I slammed the laptop shut and called it, but they couldn't find any trace of the file. They brushed it off as a phishing attempt, but I knew better. That night, the nightmares returned, more vivid and horrifying than before. The man wasn't just laughing anymore, he was closer, leaning in until I could feel his breath on my skin. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences escalated. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, but when I turned, nothing was there. Objects in my apartment weren't where I left them. My cat, usually calm and affectionate, became skittish and hissed at empty corners. In the cold, it was always cold, no matter how high I turned up the heat. Desperate, I reached out to a friend who was into the occult. I hadn't told anyone the full story yet, but she didn't seem surprised. After listening to me, she suggested I try a cleansing ritual to sever any ties to the energy from the flight. I followed her instructions to the letter, burning sage and reciting prayers she'd given me. For a moment, the air felt lighter, and I thought it had worked, until the sage stick extinguished itself mid-burn. The cold returned instantly, and I heard that same guttural laugh, faint but unmistakable, coming from behind me. I spun around, but of course, no one was there, just the faint scent of stale alcohol and metal lingering in the air. I didn't think it could get worse, but I was wrong. After the failed cleansing ritual, the activity around me grew more aggressive. Lights in my apartment would flicker and then explode, leaving shards of glass scattered across the floor. My phone would ring at odd hours, and when I answered, there'd be nothing but static, and sometimes faint whispering I couldn't quite make out. The breaking point came one night when I was sitting on my couch, trying to distract myself with a movie. The shadows in the room felt heavier than usual, pressing in on me. My cat was perched on the back of the couch, her eyes fixed on the hallway. She growled low in her throat, the fur along her spine standing on end. Then I saw it. A figure moved moved in the hallway, just a fleeting shadow, too quick to be natural. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a decorative glass vase, and stood up, heart pounding. Who's there? I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I crept toward the hallway, clutching the vase so tightly my knuckles turned white. The air grew colder with each step, and my breath came out in visible puffs. My cat hissed and bolted under the couch. When I reached the end of the hallway, I flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. The bulb didn't even flicker, it was just dead. The silence was deafening. Then, from the bathroom at the end of the hall, I heard a faint scratching sound, like nails on tile. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move. I pushed the bathroom door open with the vase, not daring to step inside. The room was empty, but the mirror over the sink had fogged up, as though someone had just taken a hot shower. In the fog, a single word was scrawled. Soon, I dropped the vase and stumbled backward, my hands shaking. The vase shattered on the floor, and the sound seemed to snap me out of my paralysis. I grabbed my cat, threw on my coat, and ran out of the apartment without looking back. I spent the night at a friend's house. She didn't ask many questions, just let me crash on her couch and listened as I spilled everything. To her credit, she didn't laugh or tell me I was crazy. Instead, she offered to help me find someone who could deal with whatever this was. The next day, she introduced me to a woman named Nadia, a self-proclaimed medium and paranormal investigator. Nadia didn't ask a lot of questions. She simply listened as I recounted the events, nodding thoughtfully. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "This isn't just a spirit. This is something older, something darker. It latched onto you during that flight, and it's feeding off your fear." Her words sent a chill down my spine. She explained that the entity likely wasn't tied to a specific place. It had chosen me. It marked you, she said, as prey. Nadia suggested a more intense cleansing ritual, one that would require confronting the entity directly. I hesitated, but what choice did I have? I couldn't live like this anymore. That weekend, we performed the ritual in my apartment. Nadia set up candles, herbs, and crystals in a circle in the middle of my living room. She instructed me to sit in the center while she chanted in a language I didn't recognize. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as if the apartment itself was resisting her efforts. Then it appeared, the man from the play. He stood just outside the circle, his face partially obscured by shadows. His notebook was gone, but his hands were clenched into fists, and his pale, glowing eyes bored into mine. His mouth twisted into a mocking grin as he spoke, his voice dripping with malice. "You can't send me away," he said. "I'm part of you now." Nadia didn't stop chanting, her voice growing louder and more insistent. The candles flickered wildly, and the circle of light around me seemed to grow brighter, pushing the figure back. He snarled, his grin fading, and for a moment, I thought the ritual was working. But then, he laughed, that same guttural, bone-chilly laugh from the plane. The candles went out all at once, plunging the room into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, he was gone. Nadia looked shaken but determined. "It's weekend," she said, "but it's not gone. You need to leave this place and never look back." I didn't need to be told twice. Within a week, I broke my lease, packed what I could, and moved to a new city far from everything familiar. It's been months now, and for the most part, things have been quiet. No more shadows, no strange noises, no cryptic messages. But sometimes, late at night, I feel that cold, suffocating air again, and I can almost hear it, that faint, guttural laugh echoing just beyond the edge of my awareness. I travel for work a lot, so airports have become a second home. The bright lights, endless corridors, and the hum of announcements are oddly comforting. But there's one layover I'll never forget, and it's the reason I refuse to fly through Salt Lake City anymore. It was late, a red-eye flight connecting to a 6 a.m. departure. My connecting gate was at the far end of the terminal, the kind where you wonder if the gate is even real. The closer I got, the fewer people I saw. Shops were closed, lights were dimmed, and the sound of my rolling suitcase echoed louder than it should. When I arrived at gate 72B, it was empty, completely empty. No agent, no passengers, just a flickering screen displaying the flight information. The gate seating area was tucked into a corner with no windows, so it felt like I was boxed in. The chairs were that dull gray vinyl, the kind that looks perpetually uninviting. I settled into one near an outlet and plugged in my phone. I hadn't been sitting for more than a few minutes when I felt watched, not in the usual someone glances at you at passing way. This felt like a deliberate, lingering presence. I looked around, but the only movement came from a janitor buffing the floors at a distance. I shook it off. Airports can be eerie when they're so quiet. That's when I noticed the gate next to mine, 72A. It looked identical to mine but darker, like the lights hadn't been fully turned on. I couldn't see anyone over there, yet I swear I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, quick and fluid, passed by the chairs. I stared at the gate, but there was nothing, just rows of empty seats and the muted hum of the ventilation system. I checked my phone, 2:43 a.m., still hours to go. I decided to walk back toward the shops to get a drink, partly to wake myself up and partly to shake the unease. As I stood, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The screen at gate 72A had flickered on. It displayed a destination I didn't recognize, Hollow Pines boarding now. There was no airline logo, no gate agent, no passengers, just that ominous message. I glanced toward the janitor, hoping for some reassurance, but he was gone, not just out of sight. His machine was abandoned mid-floor, the cord still snaking toward an outlet. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my bag and started walking briskly back toward the more populated part of the terminal. But as I passed 72A, I heard a faint, metallic sound like keys jangling. It came from the darkened gate. Against my better judgment, I glanced over. There was a figure. It stood by the boarding door, half obscured in shadow. I couldn't make out much, but it was tall and unnaturally still, like a mannequin someone had forgotten to move. The jangle came again, and I saw its hand, a skeletal-shaped clutching what looked like a ring of keys. I didn't stick around to investigate. I bolted, not caring if I looked insane. When I reached the more populated part of the terminal, I told a TSA agent about what I'd seen. He frowned, glanced at his watch, and said something that still chills me. 72A. That gate's been closed for years. The door doesn't even open anymore. I didn't sleep for the rest of the layover. When I finally boarded my flight, I made sure to sit far from the window. As the plane taxied out, I couldn't stop myself from looking back at the terminal. There was gate 72A, its darkened corner just barely visible, and standing there, near the glass, was a figure. Watching it, I spent the entire flight trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe I was just overtired, hallucinating after a long day of travel. Airports can feel like liminal spaces, places where reality seems thinner. That had to be it, I told myself. But the more I tried to convince myself, the less I believed it. When I landed at my destination, I couldn't shake the feeling that I brought something back with me. Every little noise, a cough from a passenger, the clink of a coffee cup, made me jump. I hurried out of the airport and straight to my hotel, hoping some sleep would settle my nerves. It didn't. That night, I had a nightmare so vivid it still haunts me. In it, I was back in Salt Lake City, standing at gate 72A. The figure with the keys was closer this time, its features clearer. Its skin was pale and papery, stretched taut over a face that didn't seem right. Its eyes were sunken and dark, as if they'd been scooped out and replaced with endless voids. It didn't move like a person. It twitched, jerked, and glided forward in unnatural bursts, the jangling of the keys growing louder and louder. When it was just a few feet away, it extended a hand, bony, with fingers far too long. It didn't speak, but I heard a voice in my head, low and hollow, "Your boarding pass." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The clock on the nightstand read 3:03 a.m. I sat up, trying to catch my breath, when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. On the desk in the corner of my hotel room was my boarding pass from the previous day. I could have sworn I left it in my bag, but there it was, perfectly laid out and folded in half. I didn't touch it. Instead, I grabbed my phone to distract myself, but my phone screen wouldn't turn on. No matter what I did, pressing buttons, plugging it in, it stayed dead. Frustrated and unnerved, I looked back toward the desk. The boarding pass was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my bags and went straight to the lobby, asking for an early checkout. I told myself it was paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that room. Back home, things seemed to settle. I avoided flying for a while, opting for virtual meetings whenever possible. But even now, months later, I feel like something has shifted. Every so often, when I'm in a quiet room, I'll hear a faint jingle like keys swaying on a ring. Last week, I found an old boarding pass tucked into a drawer I never use. It wasn't one I kept. This one was for a flight to Hollow Pines. The date, 2 days from now. I threw it out immediately, but I'm afraid it doesn't matter. The jingle of the keys has gotten louder. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll catch a flicker of movement in the corner of my vision. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever had attached itself to me from gate 72, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it wasn't going away. The night before the date on the mysterious boarding pass, I didn't sleep. I locked every door, closed every curtain, and sat in my living room with every light on. I clutched my phone like a lifeline, ready to call someone, anyone, if something happened, but the house was oppressively silent, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. At 3:03 a.m., the same time I'd woken from my nightmare in the hotel, the power went out. The darkness was instant and suffocating. My phone, which had been fully charged, suddenly wouldn't turn on. The only light was the faint glow of the moon through a gap in the curtains. And then I heard it. The keys. The sound was unmistakable, a soft jingle growing louder with each passing second. I wanted to run, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to echo from everywhere at once. I grabbed a flashlight from a drawer and turned it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, but it didn't offer much comfort. The sound was closer now, coming from the hallway leading to my bedroom. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give out. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No response, just the keys, jangling in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I pointed pointed the flashlight toward the hallway, and that's when I saw it. The figure from gate 72A was standing at the end of the corridor, its bony hand clutching the ring of keys. It didn't move, but its presence filled the entire house, suffocating and cold. The flashlight flickered, and in that moment, I thought I was done for. But then it did something I wasn't expecting. It extended its hand, just like in my dream, and in its other hand, it held something I hadn't noticed before, a boarding pass. The pass floated toward me as if pushed by an invisible wind. It landed at my feet, face up. The flight information was clear: Hollow Pines, gate 72A. Departure now. My name was printed on it, just as it had been on the pass I'd thrown away. The figure took a step forward, and then another, its jerky, unnatural movements making my stomach churn. The keys jingled with every motion. I backed away, but it was no use. I was trapped. In desperation, I shouted, "I'm not going with you." The figure stopped. It tilted its head, as if considering my words. Then, without warning, it let out a sound, a low, guttural laugh that resonated through the entire house. The boarding pass at my feet burst into flames, burning away to ash in seconds. The figure turned and began to fade, its form dissolving into shadows. But just before it disappeared completely, it spoke in that hollow, mind-penetrating voice. "You'll board eventually." The lights came back on, and the house was silent once more. My phone buzzed to life in my hand, showing several missed calls and messages. I didn't care. I collapsed onto the couch, shaking and exhausted. That was 3 days ago. Since then, the keys have stopped jingling, and I haven't seen the figure again. But I know it's not over. I've started finding boarding passes in strange places, on my desk at work, inside my car, even slipped under my pillow. They're all for Hollow Pines, all marked with different departure dates. This happened a few years ago when I worked as a landscaper for a private estate in a small town. The estate was massive, almost like a small village within itself, with beautifully maintained gardens, stone fountains, and hedgerows that seemed to stretch forever. Most of the grounds were open and welcoming, but there was one section that was always locked, the walled garden. It was a relic from the estate's original design, a high, ivy-covered wall enclosing about an acre of land. The gate to the garden was an old, rusted wrought iron door with a massive padlock. The owner of the estate, an elderly man who rarely left the manor, told me to never worry about it. "Nothing's back there worth your time," he said with a vague wave of his hand. "It's just a place for old memories." For months, I didn't think much about it. The grounds were beautiful and extensive enough to keep me busy. But one day, while trimming hedges along the wall, I noticed something odd. Behind the gate, I could faintly hear the sound of leaves crunching. It wasn't windy, and it wasn't the sound of animals, at least, not any I recognized. It sounded deliberate, like footsteps. I leaned closer, trying to peer through the gaps in the iron gate, but all I could see was dense, overgrown greenery. It wasn't a well-kept part of the property, so I figured it could have been a deer or something similar. I let it go, but the sound stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, I started hearing other noises whenever I was near the garden, whispers, faint and fragmented, like a conversation just out of earshot. One day, I was working near the wall when I heard a distinct laugh, a child's laugh, bright and clear, like it was right on the other side of the gate. By this point, curiosity got the better of me. I asked the estate's caretaker, an older woman named Martha, about the garden. Her face turned pale, and she avoided my eyes. "It's nothing you need to concern yourself with," she said sharply. "Just don't go near it." Her reaction only fueled my curiosity. That evening, as I was finishing up my work, I noticed the gate to the garden was ajar. The padlock dangled from the door, unlocked and swinging slightly in the breeze. I froze. No one ever went back there, and the owner had the only key, at least, as far as I knew. I hesitated, but the whispers started again, louder this time, like they were beckoning me inside. Against my better judgment, I pushed the gate open and stepped into the garden. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled of earth and decay. The garden was overgrown with wildflowers and thick vines, and the sunlight barely pierced through the canopy of trees. It was eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, just the muffled sound of my footsteps on the soft ground. As I ventured deeper, I noticed something strange. The garden seemed larger on the inside than it looked from the outside. I turned around to find the gate, but it was nowhere in sight. The path behind me was swallowed by the greenery. Panic set in, and I started walking faster, calling out for help. That's when I saw them, figures moving through the foliage. Not animals, not people, but shadows that flitted just at the edge of my vision. They didn't make a sound, but I felt them watching me. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I burst through the trees and stumbled back onto the estate's lawn. The gate was closed behind me, the padlock securely fastened. My hands were trembling, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The next day, I quit. I didn't bother explaining why. I just packed my tools and left. A week later, I received a letter from from Martha. It was short, with just one line, "You're lucky you found your way out." Others weren't so fortunate. I couldn't get the garden out of my mind, even after I left the estate. The whispers, the laughter, the figures, I questioned my sanity daily. At first, I told myself it was just a trick of the mind, that I let my curiosity and exhaustion get the better of me. But then, the dream started. In my dreams, I was back in the garden, but it was even larger than before. The overgrowth had been replaced with meticulously kept rows of flowers and perfectly trimmed hedges, but the place was no less suffocating. The shadows were clear in my dreams, tall, and possibly thin figures with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to shift and blur if I looked at them too long. They never spoke, but they always moved closer. One night, I woke up covered in dirt, my hands scratched and bleeding as if I'd been digging in my sleep. I checked the locks on my apartment door and windows. They were all secure. How had I gotten outside? Or had I? The dirt didn't feel like it came from my small backyard. It was damp and smelled faintly of that same garden. I tried to move on with my life, but strange things kept happening. I'd find ivy growing along my apartment walls, even though I lived on the second floor. I'd hear faint whispers when I was alone, though they always stopped the moment I turned to look. My reflection in the mirror seemed off, like it was moving just a split second out of sync with me. Then I received another letter, this time with no return address. The handwriting was shaky, as if whoever wrote it had been trembling. "You shouldn't have gone in. They've noticed you now. They always notice. Leave." There was no name at the bottom, but I recognized Martha's handwriting. I packed a bag and left town the next day, moving halfway across the country to stay with my sister. For a while, things were quiet. I didn't dream about the garden anymore, and the whispers stopped. I started to believe that whatever was happening to me had finally ended. But then, last week, my sister mentioned something that sent chills down my spine. She said her youngest daughter, Lily, had been talking to an invisible friend. When I asked her about it, she laughed it off, saying it was probably just an imaginary playmate. Out of curiosity and a growing sense of dread, I asked Lily about her friend. She gave me the kind of look that only little kids can give, as if I was the one being silly. "They said you'd come back soon," she said matter-of-factly. "They miss you." I froze, my heart pounding. "Who, Lily? Who misses me?" She just smiled and pointed out the window to the backyard. It was empty, just a patch of grass and a few trees. But as I stared, I swear I saw the faint outline of a high, ivy-covered wall. After Lily's chilling words, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see that ivy-covered wall. At first, I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but my sister noticed my unease. "You okay?" she asked one evening, her brow furrowed. "You've been jumpy since you got here." I wanted to tell her everything, about the estate, the garden, the shadows, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. She wouldn't believe me. Heck, I didn't fully believe me, so I just nodded and mumbled something about needy rest. That night, I woke to the sound of laughter, not Lily's laughter, though it was higher pitched, almost ethereal, and it sent a chill down my spine. I bolted upright in bed, straining to hear. The sound was faint but unmistakable, drifting in from outside. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I crept to the window. The backyard was bathed in pale moonlight, and for a moment, everything looked normal. Then I saw it. It was there, just as it had been on the estate. Tall, covered in thick ivy, and impossibly out of place in my sister's yard. My breath caught in my throat as I spotted movement near the base of the wall. Shadows, those same elongated figures, slipped between the vines, their blurred faces turned toward the house. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. The laughter grew louder, almost mocking, as if they knew I'd seen them. That's when I heard Lily's voice. Though here, her voice was coming from the hallway outside my room. I rushed to the door and yanked it open, expecting to find her standing there. Instead, the hallway was empty. My sister's bedroom door was closed, and the house was silent, except for the whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I ran to Lily's room. She was sitting on her bed, staring out the window. The same smile she'd given me earlier was plastered on her face. "They want you to come back," she said without turning around. "You shouldn't have left." I grabbed her and carried her out of the room, my mind racing. I didn't know what I was doing, only that I had to get her away from that window, away from the wall. My sister met me in the hallway, groggy and confused, but I didn't have time to explain. "We need to leave," I told her. No, to her credit, she didn't argue. Maybe she saw the panic in my eyes, or maybe she heard the whispers too. We bundled Lily into the car and drove to a motel on the edge of town. My sister asked questions, but I couldn't give her any answers that made sense. That night at the motel, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights on and watched the windows, half expecting the wall to appear again. It didn't, but the whispers never stopped. They were faint, like a distant radio signal, but they were always there. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, follow my sister and Lily. I had to go back. I left them at the motel, promising I'd return, though I wasn't sure if that was true. I drove back to the estate, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to grow. By the time I reached the gates, I was shaking. The estate looked abandoned. The gardens were overgrown, the manor dark and lifeless. Then the walled garden. The gate was open, the padlock gone. I don't remember walking inside. One moment, I was standing at the threshold. The next, I was deep in the garden, surrounded by that oppressive greenery. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. The shadows were everywhere, darting between the trees and bushes. You came back, a voice said, clear and sharp. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a shadow. It was something else, something tall and impossibly still, standing at the center of the garden. Its face shifted and blurred, just like the figures I'd seen before. You belong here. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air felt thick, like I was sinking into the ground. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and merging until they were a single, droning hum. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was lying on the lawn outside the garden. The gate closed and locked behind me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from my sister. We're okay. The whisper stopped. Lily doesn't remember anything. I stared at the gate for a long time before I got back in my car and drove away. I don't know what happened in that garden or why it let me leave, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never going back. It started on a chilly September evening. I had just finished dinner and decided to take my dog, Daisy, for a walk. Daisy was a sprightly golden retriever who loved our nightly outings, especially as the leaves began to crunch underfoot. We usually walked the same route, a loop around the neighborhood and a quick pass by the old train depot, which had been converted into a local history museum. But that night, Daisy was unusually jittery. She tugged at her leash in a way that wasn't playful. Her ears were up, and she kept glancing back. I chalked it up to her sensing a raccoon or stray cat, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept into my chest. As we approached the depot, I noticed something odd. There was a bright blue bike leaning against the side of the building. Not just any bike. It was one of those old-fashioned ones with a big front wheel and tiny back wheel. It stood out, almost cartoonishly, against the backdrop of the dimly lit museum. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone was taking photos for a quirky Instagram post, or I left it as part of some art project. But as we passed, I heard the faintest sound of giggling. Not children's giggles, mind you, but something breathy and low, like someone was deliberately trying to stifle laughter. I stopped in my tracks, my heart thudding in my chest. Daisy growled, a sound I'd never heard from her before. It wasn't her playful rumble when she had a toy in her mouth. This was deep and menacing. Hello, I called out, my voice wavering in silence. Then, from behind the bike, a shadow shifted. I swear I didn't move like a person. It almost flowed, smooth and unnatural. Before I could process what I was seeing, a figure stepped into the faint light of the depot's lamppost. The person, I think it was a person, was dressed in a tattered suit, but their face was obscured by an oversized mask. It was a crude, papier-mâché thing with exaggerated features painted in garish colors. The mouth of the mask was pulled into a wide grin, but the eyes were blank, just two hollow, black holes. I froze, unsure if I was looking at some eccentric artist or something more sinister. Daisy barked wildly, straining at her leash as the figure tilted its head, as if studying us. Then it giggled again, louder this time, almost a cackle. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. Let's go, Daisy, I whispered, yanking her leash and breaking into a jog. We didn't stop until we were back on my porch. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced back toward the street, half expecting to see that blue bike parked at the end of my driveway, but there was nothing. The next day, I told a few friends about what happened. They brushed it off, saying it was probably some weirdo pulling a prank. I wanted to believe them, but something didn't sit right. A week later, I saw the bike again. This time, it was leaning against a tree on my walking route, far from the depot. There was no one around, no giggling, no figure, just the bike, as if it was waiting for me. I haven't walked that road since. In fact, I moved out of that town altogether a few months later, but sometimes, when I'm out and about in my new city, I'll spot a flash of bright blue in the corner of my eye. It's always just a coincidence, a kid's toy, a parked bike, but my stomach knots every time. Even though I had moved away, the memories of that night lingered like a bad dream. I kept rationalizing it to myself. It was probably some eccentric performance artist or a harmless prank. Yet, deep down, I knew there was something wrong about the entire situation, something that didn't quite fit into the realm of logic. Months went by without incident, and I began to let my guard down. I convinced myself that I was overreacting, that I was safe now. But that sense of safety didn't last. One evening, as I walked home from a nearby park in my new neighborhood, I saw it again, the bike. It wasn't identical, but it was close enough. The same oversized front wheel and tiny back wheel, painted in that glaring, unnatural shade of blue. It was leaning casually against a lamp post on the corner near my apartment building. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding. Maybe it was just a coincidence. After all, old-fashioned bikes weren't exactly rare. Still, I couldn't bring myself to walk past it. Instead, I took a longer route home, sticking to well-lit streets and crowded sidewalks. sidewalks. When I finally reached my apartment, I double-checked every lock on my doors and windows, even the ones I rarely thought about. Daisy, who had been napping on the couch, lifted her head and gave me a questioning look. Her presence comforted me, even though she seemed oblivious to my unease. That night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, a soft tapping noise. I lay frozen in bed, straining to hear it. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from my living room window. Daisy began to growl, low and steady. Her ears were perked, and her eyes were fixed on the window. My apartment was on the second floor, so there was no way anyone could be tapping on it. Right, summoning every ounce of courage I had, I crept out of bed and into the living room, clutching my phone with trembling hands. The tapping stopped the moment I entered the room. The curtains were drawn, and I hesitated before pulling them back. My hand hovered over the fabric for what felt like an eternity. When I finally yanked the curtain open, my heart dropped. There was nothing there, just the empty night sky and the faint outline of the street below. I exhaled shakily, feeling equal parts relieved and foolish. Maybe I'd imagined it, or maybe it was just the wind. I tried to convince myself of that as I climbed back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, as I stepped outside with Daisy for her walk, I froze. There, leaning against a lamppost directly across the street from my building, was the bright blue bike. My stomach churned. I looked around frantically, scanning the street for anyone who might have left it there. The sidewalks were empty. I decided I'd had enough. I called the police and told them everything about the masked figure back in my old town, the bike, the tapping. The officer I spoke to was polite but clearly skeptical. Still, they agreed to send a patrol car to drive by my building a few times that night. For a while, nothing else happened. I didn't see the bike again, and I started to feel like maybe the worst was behind me. Then, about 2 weeks later, I received a package in the mail with no return address. My hand shook as I opened it, dread pulling in my stomach. Inside was a single item, a crude, papier-mâché mask with exaggerated features and hollow black eyes. The note was tucked inside the mask, scrawled in messy, childlike handwriting. It read, "This May." I moved again after that, this time to a different state. I didn't tell anyone my new address except for close family, and I've avoided social media ever since. It's been over a year now, and I haven't seen the bike, the mask, or anything else out of the ordinary. But I still check my locks every night, and whenever I hear an unexpected tap at the window, my heart skips a beat. Months passed, and life at my new home started to feel normal again. I'd gotten a new job, made a couple of friends, and even started to explore the city a little. It felt like I'd left the nightmare behind, but deep down, I never truly let my guard down. The locks, the curtains, the avoidance of certain streets or times of night, it all became second nature. Then one evening, something happened that reminded me just how fragile my sense of safety was. It was a Friday night, and I had a rare evening to myself. Daisy and I were curled up on the couch, a movie playing in the background while I absent-mindedly scrolled on my phone. I wasn't paying attention at first, but Daisy started growling, softly at first, then louder, her hackles raised. I muted the TV and sat up, heart pounding. The sound of soft laughter floated into the open window. My blood ran cold. The window wasn't directly facing the street, but overlooked a small alleyway that ran between my building and the one next door. I strained to hear, praying it was just someone walking by. The laughter was faint, but it wasn't distant. It sounded like it was coming from below the window. I froze, torn between slamming the window shut and staying completely still, hoping whoever it was would move on. Daisy let out a sharp bark, her focus fixed on the window. I decided I couldn't wait. Moving as quietly as I could, I approached the window and peered out. The alley was dimly lit, but I could make out the shape of someone standing just below. They were leaning casually against the brick wall, illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. I couldn't see their face. It was obscured by a hat or hood, but I didn't need to see it to recognize what was leaning against the wall beside them. The bright blue bike. I stumbled back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. This couldn't be happening. I hadn't seen the bike in months. I was hundreds of miles away from where this all started. How had they found me? I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling. As I explained the situation to the dispatcher, I kept my eyes on the window, terrified that the figure would try to climb up or make their way into the building. "Stay on the line," the dispatcher said. "Officers are on their way." Minutes felt like hours as I waited. I didn't dare move from my spot, clutching Daisy's leash in one hand and my phone in the other. Finally, I heard the distant sound of sirens. I peeked out the window again, expecting the figure to flee, but they didn't. They simply tilted their head toward the sound of the approaching police car, as if amused. The bike was gone when the officers arrived. They searched the alley and the surrounding streets but found nothing. No bike, no mask, no sign of anyone matching the description I'd given them. One of the officers assured me they'd keep an eye on the area, but I could tell they thought I was overreacting. I wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every shadow cast by passing headlights set me on edge. Daisy, usually a comforting presence, was restless, pacing the apartment and growling at nothing. The next morning, I found found a note taped to my door. My stomach turned as I unfolded it. The same messy handwriting stared back at me. "You're fun to find." I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I packed up Daisy and as much of my stuff as I could fit into my car and drove to a friend's house 2 states away. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my family. I deleted my social media accounts, changed my phone number, and started looking for a new place to live. It's been 6 months now, and there's been no sign of the bike, the mask, or the person behind it all. I want to believe it's over, that I've finally escaped, but I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of time. A few years ago, I worked as a part-time night guard at a local aquarium. It wasn't as glamorous as it sounds. Mostly, I spent the nights walking through dark hallways, checking exhibits, and making sure no one broke in. The place was eerie at night, with only the low hum of filtration systems and the occasional sound of water sloshing against the tanks. One particular night stands out. It was mid-October, and the air inside the building felt colder than usual. I started my usual rounds, flashlight in hand, stopping occasionally to peek at the tanks. The jellyfish exhibit always creeped me out, those ghostly creatures pulsing under the faint blue lights, but I had gotten used to it. As I passed the shark tunnel, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I stopped and turned my flashlight toward the glass, half expecting to see one of the smaller sharks gliding past. Nothing. The water was still, save for the bubbles drifting upward. I shrugged it off and kept moving. About an hour later, I was in the staff area near the cafeteria, double checking the locks on the doors. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of the main tank, the largest one in the aquarium, home to the sea turtles, rays, and some of the larger fish. I hesitated but figured it was probably a mechanical issue or some kind of animal behavior. Still, I radioed the front desk just in case. My coworker, Carla, was stationed there for the night. Her voice crackled through the radio. "Everything's quiet up here. You sure it's not just the pipes?" "Yeah, maybe," I replied, trying to convince myself. When I got to the main tank, the tapping had stopped. I stood there for a moment, scanning the room. The only sound was the gentle whoosh of water circulating. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange, a handprint on the glass. It wasn't the kind of smudge you'd see from a kid pressing their hands against the tank. This was thicker. The fingers were long, almost unnaturally so, and the print was high up, too high for a person to reach without a ladder. My stomach turned. "Carla, did anyone come through here today to clean the tanks or something?" I asked through the radio. "No, why?" she responded. I told her about the handprint, but she just laughed and said I was probably imagining things. I wanted to believe her, so I wiped the glass clean with my sleeve and continued my rounds. The rest of the night was uneventful until I checked the security cameras before clocking out. Most of the footage was boring, empty hallways and tanks, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Around the time I had been near the main tank, the camera had picked up movement. A shadow, tall and lanky, had passed in front of the tank. It wasn't a reflection, it moved independently of me, almost like it was pacing. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I quit the job a week later. I told my manager it was because of school, but the truth is, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me during those long, lonely nights. A few weeks after I quit, I got a text from Carla. "Hey, did you hear what happened at the aquarium last night?" My heart sank. I hadn't been in contact with anyone from work since I left, so I had no idea what she was talking about. I asked her to call me, and when she did, her voice was shaky, almost frantic. "They found another handprint, bigger this time," she said, "and something else." "What else?" I asked, dread pulling in my stomach. There was water, not just condensation, like someone splashed a bucket of it onto the floor near the main tank. But the weirdest part, the cameras went dark for about 10 minutes right before they found it. Completely black, no static, just nothing. I didn't know what to say. Carla kept going, like she needed to get it all out. One of the morning cleaners said she heard something, too, like scratching, coming from inside the tank. When she looked, there was nothing there, but she swears she felt something watching her. She's refusing to work night shifts now. I tried to calm her down, telling her it was probably just a prank or a malfunction, but deep down, I didn't believe it. I remembered that shadow, the handprint, the cold feeling that had settled in my chest every time I walked past that tank. A month later, I saw a news article about the aquarium. It had closed for renovations, though the article mentioned rumors about staff complaints and unexplained incidents. They didn't go into detail, but I knew. I thought that would be the end of it. But last week, I got a package in the mail. No return address, just a plain brown box. Inside was a Polaroid photo, the kind you don't see much anymore. It was blurry, but I could make out the shape of the main tank. In there, pressed against the glass, was another handprint. This time, it wasn't just one. There were several over overlapping, like whatever had left them was trying to claw its way out. I don't work there anymore. I don't even live in the same city, but I still keep my curtains closed at night, and I avoid aquariums altogether. For weeks after receiving that Polaroid, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I'd see shadows flicker in the corners of my vision, hear faint tapping sounds on my apartment windows at odd hours. The paranoia was suffocating. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to throw the Polaroid away along with the box it came in. It felt like the only way to sever whatever strange connection had been lingering since I left the aquarium. As I picked up the photo, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the corner, faint but visible, was a reflection in the glass of the tank. It wasn't me or anyone I recognized. It was taller. Its features were distorted, but there was something undeniably humanoid about it. Long limbs, a faint shiver to its form, almost like it was wet. My heart pounded as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I threw the photo into the trash, slammed the lid down, and took the whole bag out to the dumpster. As I walked back inside, I told myself that was it. Whatever this was, I wasn't going to let it follow me anymore. That night, I dreamt I was back at the aquarium. The hallways were dark, and the only sound was the soft ripple of water. I walked toward the main tank, though I didn't want to. My feet moved on their own, dragging me closer. When I reached the tank, the water was black, as if it had no bottom. And then something moved. A hand, long, pale, and webbed, pressed against the glass, followed by another. Slowly, a face emerged. It was human-like but not quite right. Its eyes were large, unblinking, and glowed faintly in the dark. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. It stared at me, and though it didn't speak, I felt its voice in my head. "You saw me." I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My room was dark and silent, but the sense of dread from the dream lingered. I glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m., and then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from my window. I froze, too terrified to move. The sound grew louder, more insistent. I finally worked up the courage to peek through the curtain, heart hammering in my chest. There was nothing there, just the empty street below. But as I turned away, I heard it again, this time from inside the apartment. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about breaking my lease or what my landlord would say. I needed to be somewhere far, far away. I'm writing this from a new apartment in another city, hoping that putting it all down will help me make sense of it. The Polaroid is gone. The aquarium is closed, but every now and then, I hear that faint tapping sound. I don't look anymore. I don't want to know what's there. About 10 years ago, I was a broke college student desperate for cash. I took whatever odd jobs I could find, and one of them was a temporary gig at a massive warehouse on the outskirts of town. It wasn't sketchy at first, just some late night inventory work for a week. The pay was decent, and the hours fit my schedule, so I signed up. The warehouse was enormous, with rows and rows of metal shelving stretching up toward the ceiling. During orientation, the manager, a no-nonsense woman named Carla, handed me a map and told me I'd mostly be working in the northern wing, which was less used. She stressed that we should stay in our assigned zones and not wander. When I asked why, she gave a vague response about safety protocols and liability. It seemed reasonable enough at the time. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I'd scan barcodes, check inventory, and occasionally hear the other workers chatting in the distance. The warehouse was eerily quiet, but I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. On the 3rd night, I was working alone in the northern wing when I started hearing faint tapping noises. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was just the building settling or one of the forklifts moving in the distance. But the tapping grew louder, more deliberate, like someone knocking on the metal shelving a few aisles away. I called out, thinking it might be one of my coworkers messing around. Hello, is someone there? No response. Feeling a little unnerved, I went back to work, trying to brush it off. But then, as I turned to grab a clipboard I'd set down, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, just a shadow darting across the end of the aisle. My heart started racing, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe one of the overhead lights flickered. I kept working, but the unease wouldn't go away. The tapping started again, this time closer. I finally decided to check it out. I walked down the aisle, scanning with my flashlight, but there was nothing there, just rows of boxes and empty shelving. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a deep, guttural voice whisper, "You're not supposed to be here." I froze. The voice came from right behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. My flashlight beam shook as I scanned the area. At that moment, the tapping turned into a loud banging, echoing through the warehouse. It was coming from multiple directions. directions now surrounding me. Panic set in, and I sprinted back toward the central area where the other workers were supposed to be. But when I got there, it was empty. Not a single person in sight. Even Carla's office was dark and locked. It was as if everyone had vanished. My phone had no service, and the warehouse's landline was on Carla's desk, behind a locked door. I wasn't about to stick around to find out what was going on. I grabbed my bag and ran for the exit. As I pushed through the heavy doors, I heard one final, ear-piercing scream echo from the northern wing. It wasn't human. It was distorted, like static mixed with a deep growl. I quit the next morning and never went back. After I quit, I tried to move on, convincing myself that stress or sleep deprivation had played tricks on my mind. But there were moments in the following weeks that made me doubt that explanation. First, a few coworkers reached out to ask why I had left so abruptly. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I just said it wasn't a good fit. One guy, Dave, paused for a moment and then said, "Yeah, I don't blame you. That place, it's weird. Did you ever hear the rumors about the North Wing?" I hesitated but asked what he meant. He lowered his voice, almost like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "People say they hear voices over there, see things that don't make sense. Carla doesn't talk about it, but she never lets new hires work there long. You were probably the unlucky exception." That sent a chill through me, but I still tried to brush it off. Maybe the rumors had gotten to me, and my imagination had filled in the gaps. Then, about a month after I quit, I ran into Carla herself at a local coffee shop. I tried to avoid her, but she spotted me and waved me over. She asked how I was doing and if I'd found another job. I gave her polite answers, but she could tell I was uncomfortable. After a pause, she leaned in and said, "I don't blame you for leaving. Honestly, I try not to stay late myself. It's safer that way." I didn't know what to say. Her face was serious, and there was something haunted in her eyes. I managed to stammer, "What do you mean by that?" Carla sighed, glancing around as if someone might overhear. "Let's just say, some things don't stay in the past. That fire left more than scars on the building." She gave me a tight smile and walked away before I could ask anything else. That was the last time I ever saw or heard from anyone connected to the warehouse. I've since moved to another city and have a completely different job, but sometimes, late at night, I think about the voice I heard, the scream, the shadow. For a while, I avoided talking about the warehouse altogether. Every time I thought about it, that guttural voice and the shadow flickering at the edge of my vision haunted me. But then, about 6 months later, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "About the Northern Wing." My stomach dropped as I debated whether to open it. Against my better judgment, I clicked. The email was short, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Hi, I hope this finds you well. You don't know me, but I worked at the warehouse a few years back. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that you had some unusual experiences there. If that's true, you're not alone. I've been trying to piece together what's really going on. I've spoken to others who work there, and there's a pattern, voices, shadows, and always in the Northern Wing. People quit, just like you, and no one talks about it. The company keeps it quiet. If you're willing to talk, I think we might be able to figure out what's happening. Please let me know. Best, Sam." I didn't reply right away. Something about the email felt wrong, like reopening a door I'd worked hard to close. But curiosity got the better of me, and a week later, I sent a cautious response, asking what Sam had found. His reply came quickly and included a chilling detail I hadn't shared with anyone. "I heard the same thing you did," he wrote, a voice that says, "You're not supposed to be here. Did it sound like it was right behind you?" I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. There was no way he could have known that. I hadn't told anyone about the exact words or how close it felt. Sam went on to explain that he'd been researching the history of the warehouse. It turned out the fire wasn't the only tragedy tied to the place. Before it was a warehouse, the building had been a factory. In the early 1900 seconds, several workers had died in a collapse caused by poor safety standards. Those who survived claimed they heard cries for help echoing through the rubble for days after the accident, even when they were certain no one else was alive. He attached an old newspaper clipping about the collapse. It mentioned a worker named Andrew who had been found crushed under a beam. Witnesses claimed that, in his final moments, he kept repeating, "You're not supposed to be here," over and over as if he was warning someone. The story gave me chills. Sam wanted to meet in person, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about digging deeper felt dangerous, like whatever was in that building might not appreciate the attention. I told him I was sorry, but I couldn't get involved anymore. He didn't push me, but his last email stuck with me. "If you ever change your mind, let me know. Just be careful. Whatever it is, it doesn't like intruders." A few months later, I heard through the grapevine that the warehouse had closed permanently. Officially, it was due to structural issues, but part of me wonders if it was something else. Something the company finally decided wasn't worth the risk. I've never gone back, and I never will. My job was mainly digitizing old documents, faded photos, handwritten ledgers, and letters donated by families in the area. The society rented out the bottom floor of an old bank building, the kind with high ceilings and decorative crown moldings. My workspace was in a cramped back room that housed our archive vault. The vault wasn't what you'd imagine, no dramatic spinning lock or piles of gold coins. It was a reinforced room where they stored fragile paper records and temperature-controlled cabinets. It had one heavy metal door, which always gave me the creeps because it locked automatically if it closed all the way. One afternoon, I was cataloging some 1920s school attendance records. The vault was unusually warm that day, and I was annoyed because the HVAC system controlling the humidity had been acting up all week. I left the vault door slightly ajar, propping it with a thick binder. I had been working for about an hour when I heard it, a soft, steady tapping like fingernails on glass. I froze, my hands hovering over a stack of documents. The tapping came again, rhythmic and deliberate. It wasn't loud, but it sounded close. The vault didn't have windows. In fact, there weren't any windows in the back half of the building. My immediate thought was that someone had gotten in, though that didn't make sense. The only way into the vault was through the main room, and the front desk staff would have seen anyone come in. I tried to shake it off and focus on my work, convincing myself it was just a weird mechanical noise. But then the tapping moved. It started behind me, then shifted to my right, and then directly in front of me on the other side of the steel cabinet I was using as a desk. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking a little. The tapping stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything over the hum of the air conditioning. Then, just as I started to convince myself it had been my imagination, I heard a soft laugh. A woman's laugh. But it wasn't warm or friendly. It was thin, brittle, like it was missing some essential piece of humanity. I shot up from my chair, knocking over a stack of papers. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The room was silent, but I swear I could feel someone watching me. I backed toward the door, ready to bolt, but as I reached for the door handle, I realized the binder I'd used to prop it open was gone. The door was closed, almost completely, just enough for the lock not to engage. I hadn't heard it move. Heart racing, I grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. I stumbled out into the main room, where my coworker Janine was sitting at her desk, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, startled. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, and I didn't answer. I just gestured toward the vault and muttered, "Someone's in there." Janine frowned and followed me back. Together, we checked every corner of the vault. Nothing. No sign of anyone. No binder. No explanation for the tapping or the laugh. The next day, the maintenance guy found the binder inside one of the sealed cabinets. He swore up and down that it would have been impossible for it to get in there without someone opening the cabinet manually. A few weeks after I quit, I couldn't shake the lingering unease. Something about that experience felt unfinished. I told myself it was just a coincidence, just an overactive imagination amplified by the isolation of working alone. But I'd also heard whispers from other employees about the vault before I left, stories they'd laughed off as small town gossip. Now I wondered if there was more to that yet. One evening, after too much wine and a little too much courage, I decided to do some digging. The Historical Society kept its own records, so I knew where to look. I still had a key to the building. Janine had forgotten to collect it, and I used it to let myself in late that night. The place was unsettlingly quiet without the buzz of daytime activity. I felt like an intruder, even though I technically still had access. I went straight to the records room, flipping through files related to the building itself. Most of it was dry. Blueprints, old photographs, a few notes on its history as a bank. Then I found something that made my blood run cold, a newspaper clipping from the 1930s. It was about a woman named Eliza Pritchard, a bank employee who had gone missing. The article speculated that she had stolen a large sum of money before disappearing. Her coworkers had claimed she was acting strangely in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, hearing things no one else could and accusing others of watching her. She was never found. I sat there, staring at the grainy black and white photo of Eliza. Her face was blurred, but her eyes seemed to follow me. The article mentioned that she had last been seen in the bank's vault, the very vault where I had heard that laugh. I tried to shake off the chill creeping up my spine. Maybe it was all just a coincidence, I told myself. But as I was about to close the folder, I noticed a handwritten note tucked behind the clipping. It wasn't dated, but the handwriting looked much more recent. It read, "The tapping started again. I hear her laughing at night. I don't think she ever left." I left the file exactly as I'd found it, my heart pounding. As I locked the building behind me, I swore I'd never set foot in there again. But here's the thing, it didn't stop. Even after I quit, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I could hear that same brittle laugh echoing in my head. Sometimes, I'd hear fate tapping at my bedroom window, even though I lived on the second floor. I've moved twice since then, but every now and then, I still feel it, the sensation of someone watching me. Just out of sight. It's always is worse at night, when everything is quiet. I don't know what Eliza wanted, or why she chose me, but I can't shake the feeling that I accidentally let something out of that vault. And if that's the case, I hope to God she never finds me. I wish I could tell you that after moving twice, things got better, that the strange sensations, the tapping, and the inexplicable laughter faded over time. But they didn't. If anything, they grew stronger. A few months ago, I was staying late at my new job, sorting through old company records in yet another dimly lit office building. I hadn't told anyone about my experience with the vault. I didn't want to sound unhinged, but late that night, as I sat alone under flickery fluorescent lights, I heard it again, the faint, rhythmic tapping. I froze, my pen hovering over a stack of papers. My rational brain tried to come up with an explanation. Maybe the HVAC system was acting up, or a tree branch was brushing against a window. But deep down, I knew better. It was the same tapping, the same pattern I'd heard back in the vault. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my work, but the sound grew louder. It started behind me, then shifted to my left. Then it stopped, replaced by the familiar brittle laugh. Not again, I whispered to myself, trying to keep calm. I grabbed my bag and practically ran out of the office, leaving the lights on behind me. I didn't even bother locking up. I just needed to get out. The walk to my car felt like a nail. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. Every rustling leaf sounded like footsteps. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally reached my car, I jumped in and locked the doors, breathing hard. I turned on the engine, and the headlights illuminated the empty parking lot. Empty, except for a faint figure standing at the far end. She was too far away to make out her features, but I could tell she was wearing something old-fashioned, like a dress from another era. She didn't move, didn't approach, just stood there, watching me. I didn't wait to find out who, or what, she was. I hit the gas and sped out of the lot, my heart racing. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, she was gone. After that night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started researching everything I could about Eliza Pritchard. I wanted to believe she was just a tragic figure tied to that old bank, but the more I read, the more I realized she was different. Her name popped up in strange places. A worker at a post office in the 1950s claimed to have seen her reflection in a locked glass case. A security guard in the 1970s quit his job after hearing her laugh in a dark storage room. I wasn't the first person she'd followed, and I don't think I'll be the last. I've started sleepy with the lights on, though it doesn't help much. The tapping still comes sometimes, faint but unmistakable, always in the quiet hours before dawn. I've tried ignoring it, but it's hard when I know she's there, just out of sight. A part of me wonders if acknowledging her was my mistake. Maybe that's how she latches on, feeding off fear and attention. But it's too late for me now. If you're ever in a quiet place, late at night, and you hear soft tapping, don't respond, don't call out, don't investigate, and whatever you do, don't laugh back. Last summer, I went to an estate sale on a whim. It was held at an old brick house just outside town. Nothing extraordinary, but large enough to pique curiosity about what treasures might be hidden inside. I'm not a collector of anything in particular, but I love the odd knick-knack, and there was a buzz around town about the mysterious collection the owners had left behind. The sale was well organized. Each room in the house had tables arranged with items for sale. The living room was filled with books, the kitchen with vintage cookware, and the bedroom displayed an array of antique jewelry and clothing. But it was the dining room that drew me in. There, propped on an easel, was a large oil portrait of a woman. She looked like she was from the 1920s, with her dark bob hair and a string of pearls that seemed to gleam against the deep green of her dress. Her eyes were striking, piercing, like she was staring right through you. I couldn't tell if it was the skill of the artist or just an optical illusion, but her gaze followed you, no matter where you stood. I don't know why I bought it. I'm not usually into portraits, especially not ones that stare you down, but something about it felt magnetic. The price was ridiculously low, almost as if they wanted to get rid of it. I paid in cash and brought it home that same afternoon. At first, it was just a conversation piece. My friends joked about how haunted it looked, and I laughed along, though part of me wondered if they were right. After a few days, though, things started to feel off. I'd hear faint sounds in the night, like soft footsteps crossing the hardwood floors, but I live alone. My cat, Milo, who is usually fearless, started avoiding the dining room where I hung the portrait. He'd hiss at the doorway if I tried to bring him near it. Then, I started waking up in the middle of the night, always at 3:13 a.m. at first. I thought it was just stress, but it became a pattern. Each time, I'd feel this strange pull to go to the dining room. I can't explain it. It was like an urge that wasn't mine. The first few nights, I resisted, but on the fourth night, curiosity won out. I stepped into the room, and for the first time, I noticed something strange about the portrait. Her expression had changed. The soft, neutral smile she'd had before was now slightly upturned, almost smug. I told myself I was imagining it, paranoia brought on by sleepless nights. But the next night, the footsteps grew louder. This time, they didn't stop. They crossed the hallway, entered my room, and stopped right beside my bed. I froze, too scared to even open my eyes, though I felt the unmistakable sensation of someone leaning over me. I could hear breathing, low and slow, inches from my face. The next morning, I decided the painting had to go. I carried it down to the basement, covered it with a sheet, and shut the door. That night, I slept with all the lights on, but it didn't help. At exactly 3:13 a.m., I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. I ran downstairs, heart pounding, and found the portrait back in the dining room, the glass over the frame shattered on the floor. The woman's expression had changed again. This time, she wasn't smiling at all. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and her eyes, her eyes, looked angry. I didn't think. I grabbed the portrait, ran outside, and drove to the nearest dumpster I could find. I didn't care about the late hour or how crazy I must have looked. I threw it in, climbed back into my car, and didn't look back. Life started to feel normal again after I got rid of the portrait. A few weeks passed, and I convinced myself that whatever had been happening was just my overactive imagination. But then, something happened that brought the fear rushing back. It started small. A package arrived at my door one afternoon with no return address. I assumed it was a delivery mix-up, but when I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside was a photo of the portrait, just the woman's face cut out from what looked like an old photograph. Her expression was different yet again. This time, her eyes seemed wider, almost manic, and her lips curled in a mocking smirk. I threw the photo away immediately, but I couldn't shake the unease. Who had sent it? How did they know about the painting? And why would anyone go out of their way to send me something like that? That night, I double-checked all the locks in my house before going to bed. Milo was unusually clingy, curling up beside me and refusing to leave my side. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a weird prank. But at 3:13 a.m., I woke up again. This time, it wasn't the sound of footsteps or breaking glass. It was the distinct feeling of pressure on my chest, like something heavy was sitting on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and when I opened my eyes, I saw her. The woman from the portrait was there, sitting on the edge of my bed, her face inches from mine. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and her lips were twisted into a cruel smile. She didn't say anything, but I felt an overwhelming sense of malice radiating from her. I don't know how long I was frozen like that, seconds, minutes. It felt like an eternity, and then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. The weight lifted, and I could move again. Milo was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear him pissing and growling from somewhere in the house. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just drove until I found a cheap motel a few towns over. I stayed there for a week, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to believe it was all in my head, but the fear was too real to ignore. When I finally returned home, the house felt different. The air was heavier, and the shadows seemed darker. Milo wouldn't come inside, no matter how much I coaxed him. I spent that first night on the couch, too scared to sleep in my bedroom. And, of course, at 3:13 a.m., I woke up again. This time, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the basement. It was slow and rhythmic, like someone lightly knocking on the walls. My heart raced as I crept down the stairs, armed with nothing but my phone flashlight. The tapping grew louder as I approached the basement door. When I opened it, the tapping stopped. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, shining the light into the darkness below, and that's when I saw it. The portrait was back. It was sitting in the middle of the basement floor, completely uncovered, and the woman's face was different yet again. Her eyes were fixed on me, her smile wide and malicious. Written across the canvas, in what looked like deep red paint, were the words, "You can't get rid of me." I slammed the door and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was back in my car. I don't remember much of the drive, but I ended up at a friend's house across town. I told them everything, and they didn't hesitate to let me stay. That was 6 months ago. I haven't been back to the house since. I put it on the market, but so far, no one's shown much interest. I don't blame them. Even just thinking about that place makes my skin crawl. As for the portrait, I don't know how it found its way back, and I don't want to know. All I can hope is that whoever ends up buying the house doesn't find it. I tried to move on, and I rented a small apartment on the other side of town and filled it with light, lamps, candles, anything to keep the dark corners at bay. Milo adjusted quickly and seemed happier there, which gave me some relief. I even started therapy, hoping to rationalize the fear that still gripped me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't something therapy could fix. About a month after I moved, I received a call from my real estate agent. They were excited. They'd found a buyer for the house, someone who didn't seem deterred by the old brick exterior or the slightly eerie atmosphere. I felt a rush of relief. If the house was sold, maybe I could finally close this chapter of my life. But then the agent mentioned something odd. When I did the final walkthrough, I noticed an old painting in the basement. They said, "I thought you cleared everything out." My stomach dropped. "Hi, I don't remember leaving anything behind." I stammered, my voice barely steady. "What did it look like?" "It's just a portrait of a woman," they replied casually. "A little creepy, honestly. Her eyes follow you around the room." I was going to get rid of it, but the buyer saw it and said they wanted to keep it. Said it adds character to the house. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced with images of the woman's ever-changing expressions, her piercing eyes, and that chilly message scrawled across the canvas. Can you describe her expression? I finally asked, my voice trembling. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Now that you mention it, it's strange. I could swear she was smiling before, but today she looks angry, almost like she's glaring at me. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My throat felt like it was closing up. Anyway, it's not my problem anymore, the agent said with a nervous laugh. The buyer insisted on keeping it, so you're officially off the hook. Congratulations. I hung up without saying goodbye. The relief I'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. I told myself it was over, the house and the painting were someone else's problem now. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. 2 weeks later, I woke up to a voicemail from an unknown number. The message was garbled, filled with static and distant echoes, but I could just make out a few words. Why did you leave me? The voice was female, cold and accusatory, and it sent a chill down my spine. I blocked the number, but the calls didn't stop. They came at all hours, sometimes with nothing but heavy breathing, other times with that same chilly voice repeating the question, why did you leave me? I changed my number. It didn't help. The calls kept coming. Then, one night, I came home from work to find my front door slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, clutching my keys like a weapon. The apartment was eerily quiet, and everything looked normal until I stepped into the living room. The portrait was there, leaning against the wall. The woman's face was twisted into an expression of pure rage. Her eyes burned with malice, and her mouth was open in a silent scream. I ran out of the apartment. It didn't stop until I was in my car, Milo clutched tightly in my arms. I didn't know where to go, but I couldn't stay there. I drove aimlessly for hours, eventually pulling into the parking lot of an all-night diner. I sat there, shaking, trying to figure out what to do. I ended up calling the only person I could think of, my friend Kate, the one who let me stay with her after the first incident. She didn't hesitate to let me crash at her place again. But when I arrived, Milo's still in tow. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the full story. I just said there had been a break-in and left it at that. The portrait didn't follow me to Kate's, at least not physically, but the dream started that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's face. Sometimes she was smiling, sometimes screaming, sometimes staring at me with that same accusatory glare. No matter how much I tried to shake it off, I woke up at 3:13 a.m. every single night, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. It's been 3 months since the portrait showed up in my apartment. I haven't been back there, and I don't plan to, but the calls and the dreams haven't stopped. Every so often, I wake up with the feeling that someone is standing over me, watching, waiting. I've thought about going back to the house, about confronting whatever this is, but I'm terrified of what I might find. For now, I'm just trying to keep moving, keep running, but deep down, I know I can't run forever. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.